Alors, bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, et bienvenue à la web-diffusion du Congrès biennal du Parti libéral du Canada. Mon nom est François-Philippe Champagne, je viens de Shawinigan, dans le comté de Saint-Maurice-Champlain, et j'aurai le plaisir aujourd'hui d'être votre co-animateur avec Bernadette Clément.
Bon samedi matin, tout le monde. Welcome to Liberal Live. My name is Bernadette Clément, co-host with François. And we're going to start off by going to the community desk for a little bit of a chat with the online audience. Tell us what's going on, what we've heard since yesterday. Wrap things up. Merci, André.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. Remember, you can follow the day's events at hashtag Lib14, that's LIB14. And please share the webcast with everybody you know. Invite them to join us today. We're going to have a really good program for you, so this should be fun.
Alors, nous revoilà pour la troisième journée du Congrès biennal. Comme vous le savez, on utilise le mot-clic LIB14, L-I-B 14. Nous serons avec vous, toute l'équipe ici à Libéral en direct, toute la journée à libéral.ca. Et à toi, Vinay.
Good morning, everybody. We've had over 17,000 tweets to date on the hashtag Lib14 tag, and it's bright and early here. And everyone from Michael Broders from Ottawa, Harpreet from Toronto, Danny and PEI, and Suk from Surrey are all here, and we're happy to have you here too. Thanks. Over to you guys.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have the pleasure this morning to start our beautiful day with an amazing guest, Teddy Goff, who worked on the Obama campaign and was key in the digital strategy that led to their victory. Teddy, why don't you tell us a bit more about who you are and what you do? You have a very long curriculum. I could go on for a number of minutes, but why don't you tell our viewers across Canada what you've done and what you do now?
Well, first of all, thank you both for having me in this beautiful city, one of my very favorites. I'm now a founder of a small company called Precision Strategies, but before that, as you said, I was the head of digital strategy for President Obama's campaign in 2012. So I oversaw about 250 folks who did social media, email, web, mobile platforms, online advertising, online fundraising, all that sort of stuff, and I'm thrilled to be here speaking to the convention in a couple hours about that.
Wow, that's quite an impressive guest we have this morning. Thanks to be with us.
Yes. Well, yesterday we heard from Jennifer O'Malley-Dillon, who also
Heard of her?
worked.
Yeah.
Yes, you have.
Yeah.
And we were very interested because the themes of this conference are around political organization and how we engage with people. So, what approaches have you brought through your current company, but on the campaign, specific approaches? Yes.
Well, you know, I think you have to look at how much the world has changed and the technology has changed and the way we live our lives has changed over the past 10 years or so. I mean, even just between the first Obama campaign and the second Obama campaign, on Election Day 2008, Facebook was less than a tenth the size it is today. No one had heard of WhatsApp yet. It wasn't around. Twitter was, so young and so new that we didn't think about it. I mean, I don't think it came up in a meeting once. You know, there was an intern who pasted content onto Twitter if she had time. And so, now, just by comparison, President Obama had 34 million Facebook fans on Election Day. Those people are friends with 98% of the U.S.-based Facebook population.
Really?
Yeah, and that's more than the number of people who vote. So, you have this newfound ability not just to reach almost everybody, which you used to be able to do through ads, but to reach them via people they trust, to build up relationships with, with supporters and then deploy them to do your talking for you and to do the organizing work for you. And it turns out the undecided voters tend to trust their friends more than they trust, some ad or some politician. So it works out better that way anyway.
So tell us perhaps, I'm sure our viewers across Canada and perhaps across the world, we may have people listening to us also in the United States, what are the key lessons learned that you would say would be applicable in the Canadian context? Obviously here we are in a Liberal convention in Canada. People are probably asking, what's the bridge between your vast experience and winning strategy? Mm-hmm. How do we bring that back in Canada?
Well, look, I think the bridge is pretty clear, and I think the lessons learned should apply directly. Now, obviously, it's a different governmental system, 3 major parties and not just 2, but I think that actually makes some of this stuff more important because in the U.S. you're fighting over such a tiny percentage of the population who doesn't know how they're going to vote, and any kind of a multi-party system has a little bit more up for grabs, and that makes that means there's more people deciding who they're going to vote for rather than already knowing, and I think that means the role of the organizer, the role of the community organizer, the role of the person locally, talking to their friends and their neighbors about who they're going to vote for is actually that much higher. And obviously, this is a country just like the U.S. where virtually everybody is online. A huge mobile phone penetration, huge internet penetration. There's some of the details around how important fundraising is here relative to how important it is in our context. Some of that stuff changes, but fundamentally, here just like there, people are living their lives and getting their information and communicating with friends online. Come next year, they'll be making political decisions online too, and that means that all this stuff applies very directly.
Wow. So how do you work with a campaign? And yesterday we had guests telling us about, having the digital infrastructure and then being able to train people to use it, train volunteers. So how would you work with a candidate, or how would your company do that?
Well, how we do it, I don't want to pitch my company on air. Look, I think...
Or with the campaign.
Yeah, look, within the campaign, one of the things that is, I think, very clear is that digital needs to be integrated into how everything works. And so, we had a centralized department, and that was important, I thought, to be able to run a program and have a consistent tone of voice and things like that. But it wasn't as if we didn't communicate online, it wasn't as if we didn't organize online, it wasn't as if we didn't fundraise online. So we really tried to work with everybody and top to bottom. So we tried to, have the president himself engaged to the extent that he had time, which was, of course, not much, and then from paid organizers down to the grassroots volunteer who may only, have time for 5 or 10 minutes, a week of activity. We wanted everybody to be as engaged as they could and trying to be local validators for us. And that was a big, task, obviously. But it's critical based on how people get. Unfortunately, direct mail, is most people, we don't even have their address anymore. I mean, this is something I find fascinating. Of our target voters, 18 to 29 years old. So, very important population, young people. Sure. We don't have a phone number for more than half of them. They don't have landlines, and so they've got a cell phone. Cell phone numbers change. They're not in the yellow phone book anymore. The only way we can reach these people is online. So that's why it had to be part of everything we did in every state and every function and at every level.
And this was by 2012, right?
By 2012.
2008 was still very different.
2008, yeah. I mean, it's funny because I think a lot of people looked at the 2008 Obama campaign as being very digitally savvy, and it absolutely was. But just the technology was so much less advanced at that point, and the penetration was so much less vast. So, I mean, the iPhone came out in the summer of 2007 when Senator Obama was already running.
It's amazing.
So we actually had a campaign before we had an iPhone.
You go back to these things, you think it's... So for our viewers across Canada who may say, well, okay, I hear you, I appreciate that might be for a younger crowd, but what was the essence of your success with maybe voters who are not, sometimes we talk about the digital divide in the world, now much less so applicable in Canada and the U.S., but there are still some people who might not be so well connected with all these platforms. You talk about Twitter, Facebook. There might be viewers who say, how do you reach the others?
Yep,
what
absolutely.
Have you done? I'm sure that was a question you must have confronted.
It's a great question. Well, look, first of all, I think it's important to note that this doesn't replace TV ads. This doesn't replace organizing. So there are absolutely certain people you can't reach online. There are also people you can reach online, but you can also reach offline, and you want to reach them in both places. But, it is increasingly important, and I think, first of all, the Facebook and Twitter and the internet at large are not as young as people might think. In the U.S., and I don't know the same stat for Canada, but in the U.S., more than half of Americans 50 and over are on Facebook.
Really?
More than half. And that's just Facebook. So, think about email. Something like 85% of Americans 50 and up check their email every day.
Well, in fact, the younger demographic is coming off Facebook.
Yeah,
right?
yes,
so
yes,
we're
exactly.
already moving into a different trend.
Exactly. I think that's a whole fascinating topic in its own right, is how different age groups use these tools differently. But clearly, older people, maybe a little bit less on Facebook than younger people, but they're not on Facebook, and they're on email, they're checking websites, they're looking at ads, and also, it's important to note, part of what we were doing was trying to organize people so that they could have conversations in real life, so that they could knock on doors. So if we had a 21-year-old checking our Facebook page, we're fine if he or she is talking to his or her grandma at dinner instead of on Facebook. That's just fine with us.
Let me ask you something before we go to our community in French. We have a number of French viewers, and we have the pleasure. Teddy Goff, qui est avec nous aujourd'hui, comprend aussi le français, alors c'est impressionnant. Je vais vous dire, Teddy Goff était directeur des services numériques de la campagne d'Obama, donc c'est vraiment un plaisir de l'avoir avec nous. Racontez-nous une anecdote durant la campagne qui démontre l'importance du numérique dans les campagnes. What I was saying to our French viewers is, Something. Give us an answer. Vous avez compris. Alors, allez-y. Give us maybe an answer in English. That's fine.
Yeah, that would be better. Sure. Well, look, I would think about moments like a great moment that I'll talk about a little bit later, and
Sure.
that I think my colleague talked about yesterday. At the Republican convention in 2012, Governor Romney had Clint Eastwood come and give his little performance with the chair. Yeah. And, to me, that's a perfect example of how 4 years earlier, 8 years earlier, we might have done nothing, or we might have given a statement to the press, and that statement might have been in the next day's newspapers. But, the experience of however many millions of Obama supporters, 10, 20 million Obama supporters that night, they're watching TV, they're seeing our guy get insulted, get mocked, get, treated disrespectfully. And, they either never hear us respond or they don't hear us respond until a one-sentence quote in the New York Times the next morning. What we did in this cycle, because of the way the landscape has changed, is responded on Twitter and Facebook that night, and also put out an email that night. The tweet, I'll show it later. It was our most successful tweet of the whole campaign. But and it really fired people up to the point that when we got to our convention the next week, people were selling T-shirts and buttons with the picture of that tweet that we'd put out. So you take something that could have been a downer, could have been insulting, could have been something that people went to bed feeling a little demotivated, and instead they felt motivated by it.
But you have to respond quickly, right?
Yes.
So this is the thing about social media, that it's instantaneous.
Sure.
Yeah. So
Well, I think our brains are wired differently. We just expect, we move on quickly. We expect an immediate response.
we're going to go to the community desk because we have 3 people who have been engaging with our viewers online in different formats, and they have questions of their own, and they're digitally connected. So we're going to go to André.
André.
Yes. Okay. So we actually have
I'll repeat.
we have an interesting question from Diane Dajnem, where she's asking if there were 1 or 2 social platforms to choose from to reach out to the younger people, which one would have the best reach?
Preferred platform for reaching youth.
For reaching youth, well, as you said earlier, that is changing so quickly. I don't even think the answer now is necessarily the answer that we would have had in 2012. Look, I think it's easy. Well, that being said, I think it's easy to overstate the decline of Facebook or the growth of one of these other platforms. The fact is that Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, are still the predominant social networks, and especially because a couple of them are so built into how we sign into other websites, how we make payments for things, how we communicate with people, including our families. It's hard to imagine a really instantaneous decline like might have happened with Friendster or MySpace, 10 years ago. So, I think, anybody would do well to keep an eye on Snapchat, keep an eye, of course, on WhatsApp, which had the blockbuster news this week. But Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, those are still key. And I would also say email. Nobody ever talks about email, but the fact is, young people don't love email. They associate it's a little formal. It's it's not as speedy as texting.
But
of course,
it stayed alive throughout this process.
it's indispensable. It's very important for politics because it's great for organizing, it's great for fundraising. But no matter how much you want to text, sometimes you need to take some time, write out something a little longer, maybe attach a document. That stuff isn't going away. So email continues to be important.
How do you stay current yourself? Like, how do you stay on top of all of those?
Look, that's a great question. And it's a real challenge. It's amazing to me. I'm only 28 years old, and I'm already aged out of some of these platforms. And in fact, I've got a colleague of mine who's 23 or 24 who says that. The 18-year-olds that he knows, his younger brother and his friends, use platforms in a completely different way, even from him.
We need to keep up with you. I'm 43. That way we're getting.
It's incredible, and people just use these platforms so differently. I think a year ago you would have laughed if you'd heard that young people think Facebook is passé and for old people, and now that's where we are. So it's very difficult. I spend a lot of time reading, articles I see on Twitter and things like that. Not usually about Twitter, but about the next thing. And I'm sure I'll be obsolete and a dinosaur, before I'm 30.
Don't say that.
Maybe we have another question, André, from our great audience online, because this conference is also their conference, so we want to make it them to participate. André.
We had an interesting question, a rather open-ended question about best practices. Clearly, as we've mentioned before, so Obama's campaign broke new ground. So what would be some of the 1 or 2 best practices or key points to highlight to our audience?
Best practice in the campaign.
That's obvious. Obviously you could talk. This was 2 years of my life, so I could talk about that at greater length than anybody cares to hear. But I guess I would say, I think there's been and continues to be a real shift in the way people interact with organizations and with the media and with content generally. And I think a sort of traditional PR or marketing perspective 20 or even 10 or even 5 years ago might have been what's our message, what are we trying to say to people, not what do people want to hear. And you always have to think about when my parents were growing up, there were 3 television stations and you couldn't fast forward commercials, and so if you wanted to watch something or consume something at, in the evening, you had to pick one of your stations, and that was that. Now, when I was growing up, you had 80 stations, but you couldn't fast forward commercials. Now a person who's, what's the voting age here? 18.
Yeah.
18. Yeah. So a person who's going to be able to vote for the first time in next year's election, or excuse me, in this year's election, will. Was 9 or was 7, when Facebook was created. And so, they've never experienced a time when, when they couldn't read and watch and do whatever they want, relative to having to just sort of sit down and, watch the ads that someone's paying to put in front of them, or what NBC or CBC or whoever, want to broadcast to them. And that's a really fundamental change, and it means, any politician, any corporate brand for that matter, has to be so attuned to what's actually interesting to people, what's actually relevant, what's actually useful, and, really be much more service-oriented and much more intent on listening than in, saying, here's my message, let me hammer you over the head with it, until you get the point. Nobody cares. Nobody has to listen to that.
Maybe, je pense que Christine, vous avez une question de la communauté. Allez-y.
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, we have a comment from Ralph Rizzuto, and he just wanted to mention that youth unemployment is presently at 14%. So Teddy Goff is critical. So Teddy Goff's approach is critical to reach digital youth for the Liberal votes for all. So I think that's a really important
digital engagement
component to remember.
Yeah.
For a question, have you worked with text messaging as an engagement tool? Is it considered social media?
Text.
Sure. Of course it's social. I mean, it's the most basic social tool. I mean, it's people talking to other people. We used it a little bit in 12. I think if our election cycle were on your timeline, we'd be using it more this time around than we did last time around. It's a little bit, and I think a lot of campaigns are going to have to figure out exactly how they want to use these new services that are taking over the world. One thing I think is really interesting is that we had this, expansion of a very public notion of social. So social meant, broadcasting to all of your friends what you're doing all the time. And that's sort of, people, not everybody wants to do that all the time. And that's why you see Snapchat where the messages disappear, so it's public but it's not permanent. And that's why you see, so much interest in texting services which are social in that it's people interacting with other people, but not, broadcast, not permanent, it's just a human-to-human interaction or a human-to-group interaction in the case of a group me. So I think that's really interesting. I think, it's part of the reason I believe that people aren't really changing, so the technology around us is changing, but, we still want to just sort of have quiet, private lives and have our friends and have real relationships with people.
But that's a very profound statement coming from somebody who's a digital expert to say, old school. The real communications are, the base is person to person.
Look, I think obviously the way in which we lead our lives is changing, and politics is changing and all that, and will continue to change in ways it's impossible for me to predict, but I don't think that our the hardwiring that we have as people is changing all that much. And I think it's very instructive that, the young generation, the first generation that really grew up with no notion of what life used to be like. Even at my age, I remember before the internet, I remember before Facebook, obviously. Well, today's kids don't. And, the choice that they appear to be making is, I don't want my life to be about telling everyone what I'm eating for breakfast and, having a permanent record of everything I've ever done. I really just want to have friendships and conversations and connections. So I think it's very encouraging.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Let me ask a last question. I know we know you need to go on the panel now. Fast forward, 10 years from now, what do you see? I mean, you're a great thinker. You've been at the forefront of all technologies. I'm sure people at home would like to know. What do you think 10 years from now? What would you say the 2-3 things that come to your mind that would change how campaigns are run and digital and social media? What do you see?
Well, 10 years is a long time. Let me talk about 5 years. 10 years, I have no idea. Look, I think a couple things are pretty clear, and a couple things, and I think we'll also continue to be surprised. I think the ability of campaigns to serve, or marketers or anybody to serve up a more personalized, targeted experience.
We're going to the main stage. Yeah, thank you, Teddy. Stay with us.
You got me out of having to answer that hard question.
Thank you. Stay with us.